Hi everyone, and welcome to this 9th issue of our gas membrane installation bite-sized training into the National Vocational Qualification NVQ Level 2. I'm Neil Selvage and welcome along. Today we're going to be carrying on our journey looking at our occupational standards, the NOS, National Occupational Standards, and there's some good news because when we were working on our previous unit, 612, which was the preparing to install, 613, which we're looking at now, virtually mirrors what we've already been doing. So what we've been doing in our planning and preparing is now going to actually be carried out as part of our installing the gas membranes. So hopefully I'll be able to bring some insight into how they are looked at during the assessment process. So when we look at the unit, the first unit that we did way back when, I think it was issue 2, 612 1.1 preparing and 613 1.1 installing, they're identical. So it's just the context of actually interpreting what you're doing, so using the drawings on site and actually carrying out what's on the drawing. So that's going to be followed through during the course of the assessment. Often both of these elements are conducted at the same time in the assessment process. We don't duplicate it and do it off-site and then do it on-site. It's kind of mirrored, because if you're doing it in one context, all being well, you'll be doing it in the following context on-site, or vice versa. The first real changes come around in unit 4.1, where we can see there we've got a describe element, and in 612 we were looking at the use of primers, venting media, venting outlets. So it's a lot of the elements that go on before the actual gas membrane goes in, but still very important to the gas protection system. It's part of the design. So in this instance, because some of this is done by others, understanding what your roles in this will be carried out in a preparing situation where you can tell us what's going on. We might come on site and actually see this being carried out. But if you look in 613 4.1, we look very much more at the membranes and the tapes and self-adhesives, the use of different formations of top hats, for example. Cavity, there's some venting products there that are mentioned as well, and protection media. How are we going to keep that membrane safe after we've gone and during the build process? So slight differences there. And again, understanding, one of the key ones that I look at with learners is understanding the membranes, because you are really the last point of safety. Okay, the verify will come in behind you, but installing membranes, knowing that it's the product that's been specified, so what you're looking at that you've been either delivered to site or put in the back of your van from your yard, does that match up to what the drawing tells you to use? Because it's no good thundering ahead, putting a load of membrane down, just assuming it's the right product. You need to be checking this and understanding that it's correct. Yeah, if it's not, it's a reporting issue. We need to raise that ideally back with your line managers to find out why have you got a blue membrane when you should be using a green membrane or a yellow membrane, etc. Yeah, so quite a common question I will ask you: how do you know you've got the right product? We also look at the primers, tapes, self-adhesives. So in this sector, again, we look at the limitations of what they can and can't do. Some of the limitations with the weather, for example, do they perform in cold weather as well as they do in hot weather? Do they perform in certain conditions where there might be dust, or, we always read on, for example, putting primers in, the area must be clean and free from dust. So also the cost and the health and safety elements that are associated with the product. So are there going to be hazardous backings on these? Is there a waste issue with the product that you're using as well? A lot of backing papers come off the self-adhesive products. Can you dispose of them? So all elements where I expect the learner to give me their insight of what they think, or their reading of instructions, method statement, how they apply it, and that should lead us on nicely to, so that we can see the working method adheres to your understanding of the product's limitations. We also look at some of the detailing using, for example, preformed corners, where we have here an example of preformed pipe penetrations. We've also got preformed corners, and the awkward one is the preformed stanchion, which isn't really that common. I don't think I've seen a preformed corner in a good number of years. But sometimes, it might be specified whether they're available or not. But the working method, a lot of technicians are asked, what do you prefer? They might turn around and say, well, preformed for the top hat, but when I get to a stanchion, which is varied and very complicated, time consuming, I will detail that according, using a self-adhesive product. And is it appropriate for the environment of the ground condition? So looking at what the site investigation has already told your designers or those that have detailed this work, they will be able to say, yep, we can use tapes for this environment, or they might want to stick with preformed units because it's safer, especially if you're in that VOC environment where tape jointing is not permitted. So we carry on to unit 7.2. Again, on the initial 612, we looked at the venting performance, but here we can see the change now. It becomes install gas membranes to an oversight, given working instruction. So that is actually watching you in a very holistic way as it happens, putting that membrane in and making the system work. Yeah. So our on-site observations are numerous within watching, observing the work, 2, discussing it with yourself, two-way conversation, dialogue about what's happening. We can capture a lot of the elements of limitations, performance, hazards, and so on. And another one is reviewing. So you can see a clip there at the bottom with me. I use a little GoPro camera, capture video evidence, which supports your portfolio. But then we might want to recap that on site and have a quick little look at it. Bit like match of the day, I always say, review the game and see any bits that weren't quite right or anything you noticed. And as we carry on, still in the 7th unit here, 7.3, and it becomes quite a large unit here for setting out the membranes, determining direction, layout membranes, ensuring specific overlaps, and so on. You can see it's quite defined, and this is the real belt and braces of putting the gas membrane in here. And it is a descriptive unit, so it's state and describe, so I'd expect there to be knowledge from the learner of how this is done. And again, it's observing. While I'm observing, I might ask questions about how you're doing it, why you're doing it, and all the elements that go around your work. So and one of the important ones there is carry out visual checks and pick tests. So how do you inspect your work when you've completed it? And again, working with your colleagues, you might have to carry out repairs if you find your colleagues done something or something's highlighted in your own checks. So be aware of that as we go through the observation stage of the assessment. Yeah. So the next unit is, well, we're still in the seventh element here. Safely use and store materials. State the needs of other occupations, and also describe how to maintain tools and equipment. So again, this is pretty much ongoing on site discussion elements, observation elements, and if you're using, for example, a common tool that's commonly used is the Triac Leicester heat guns, knowing how they operate. Are you heating them up and setting them up as required by the guidance of the product? Are you getting sufficient heat to actually form a good seal, and how do you know that seal's effective? Are you doing any sample welds before you actually go into a live seam and do a main joint or start detailing, for example? So they're all things that we like to observe. And one of the critical ones as well is how to maintain it when you finish using the equipment. Do you cool the elements down before you put it back in the box? Have you got a box? Is it stored safely and securely? And we talked about that in our previous unit about security of products, both on site and when you take them away from site. Then I always like to say to installers, practice what you preach. A lot of people say, yeah, we're good at housekeeping, we keep the job nice and tidy. Often PPE might slip a little bit, especially if you're working in hot weather. You might decide not to put your hard hat on because it's very sweaty and uncomfortable. But also, you should be adhering to everything that's stated in your method statement and your risk assessment. Deviating from that can not only be costly to you, as in it could potentially injure you, harm you, but also it could knock back to the consequences if it goes further up the ladder and intervention by the health and safety executives called into play. Then your employer's also going to be liable as well. If they've written into their risk assessment and method statements, you will perform good housekeeping, for example, if there was a fire, or not using PPE. If they've written it into your method statement, risk assessment, and you deviate from that, you will be liable. and also your employer will be liable to a certain extent because it's not been upheld. So be mindful of that as well during the assessment process. So that wraps up our 613 very quickly, that one, but I think a lot of the work was done in our previous issues to really support that going through. Going to be looking at the next issue is to bring in our third, and this is a mandatory unit that goes across all MVQs, which is 641, which is the health and safety primarily, but I look at it specifically to ground gases and gas membrane installation. So hopefully you can join me for that one. I'm here on my usual channels. There's a link now on my website to join you. So if you go onto my website, there is a YouTube link there to bring you up to these training modules. But thanks again for joining us, and hopefully it's helpful. And I look forward to seeing you all next time round when we're going to some of the health and safety elements. So thanks for joining us. Take care.